Greetings. Hello, everybody. I'm Andrew Lewis. I'm coming to you from Canada. So yesterday, when I arrived, I was speaking to some organizers, and we were talking about the weather, as we do, to make friends. And the organizer stumbled and like paused, and he was stressed about something. And I realized he was trying to think of the Fahrenheit temperatures. So I just want to remind everybody, we're Canadian. We're the ones that use the metric system. So yeah. So a lot of my talk today is going to be about history. We don't talk about it too much in tech conferences. History in tech usually means something like this. In the past, we used to use var. Now we use let. So that's an idea of history in a tech conference. If we go to ancient history, we do something like this. We go to jQuery spaghetti. This is ancient history. And then if we want to talk about prehistory, we go even further back to the on-click handlers. So this is generally what tech history is about. I'm going to talk to you about a different kind of history. It's the kind with a lot of black and white photos. So we're going way back into the history. And our story starts in the 1930s. And it involves this person that Reg mentioned, Vannevar Bush. So Vannevar Bush was an engineer, a tinkerer. He worked out of MIT. And he was one of the first people to put together these incredible analog computers. And it was a computer that worked with it was completely mechanical. There was no digital parts. And they solved really cool problems, mostly calculus. This is a picture of one of his calculus machines. And it's pretty cool if you have time to read the history. The operator actually traces the curve, and the integral is done mechanically. So these are very, very cool devices that he pioneered. As his career developed, something typical happened. He was pushed into management, and he became a manager. And his role changed from being an engineer to being a manager of people. In the 1940s, something big happened to everybody working in America and the world. World War II happened, and everybody was pressed into service in one way or other. And this included Vannevar Bush, and he was responsible for leading all the scientific research and development during the war. And he got recognized in Time magazine, and he had a big part in the research development that was happening in the war. But there was a big change happening because of World War II. There was an explosion in information. So all these new bureaucracies sprung up. Information was being produced, paper was being produced, and there were no systems to handle this, and it was unprecedented. So you could just visualize the amount of new information being created, whole rooms of information and paper just being generated. And for Vannevar Bush, this is a particularly dangerous problem for him because his role was to read documents, read reports, find out what was happening in science, and distill it down into advice that he could give the president. So every day he was just bombarded with new information that he had to make sense of and process. And a phrase he used is, we are being buried under our own product. So technology was allowing us to create new information. It was able to report and come back with new information. But the tools we had to understand it and make sense of it weren't keeping up, and we were being buried. So as World War II wrapped up, he put his engineer hat back on, and he came up with a device that would solve all these problems, and he published this in 1945. So he's saying, consider a future device for individual use, mechanized private library, and he called this thing, just randomly picked a name, he called it a Memex. So the Memex was a device. The idea would be that you'd put all your library, your correspondence, your photos, every piece of information that you come across into this mechanical device, and then you could search through it, you could organize it, you could look things up, you could make notes, and this would solve a lot of problems for people. This is an illustration of what the Memex could look like. A pretty simple device. It has two screens. In the right corner, there's a control pad for punching up what records you're looking for, and then everything was based on microfilm. So again, you'd put all your personal library into this Memex device. It would have this cool stylus for adding notes. Came with this voice recorder that you could add voice memos and audio recordings into. It even came out with this clip-on camera, pretty ahead of its time, perhaps, which you could use to add notes into your Memex. And this was the most important thing about the Memex. This is the reason we're still talking about it today. Vannevar Bush realized that a lot of libraries are organized around alphabetical indexes or categorical indexes, but that's not really how the brain works. Our brain works by association. We might remember who we were with, or where we were, or what something is related to. And Vannevar Bush wanted a device that mimicked that kind of structure, the graph-like structure of the human brain, into a device. So his whole design was based around being able to reproduce this in a mechanical device. So if we imagine all the documents in the Memex, your different documents, your reports, your videos, as a user goes through and navigates through the data that's in the Memex, the trails would be recorded. And the trails could be used later on to look up things and to re-navigate it or see what the context of how that data got into the Memex. So it was really ahead of its time. The unfortunate thing about the Memex, anyway, you know what's coming here, 0 were produced. It was never built. It was purely a conceptual device that was only written about. So this made me really sad. I heard about this. It's such a great idea. It never got built, and I feel in some ways we still don't have a Memex. So I was really sad about it. Just a little bit about me. I'm an information pack rat. So if I've ever produced or come across information, there's a good chance I've tried to hang on to it or store it or keep it for later. This is a bit of a problem. But this is my grade 5 journal. So I started keeping journals like pretty early on. I've been writing them on and off since then. This is my kindergarten report card that I kept, or actually my mom kept, knowing that I would be like this, perhaps. These are all the movie stubs. I started collecting them, and I've never stopped. I have a collection of all these. Before Google Maps, I started trying to track my walks through the city, just to understand where I've been. I even horrifically kept all my high school chat logs. There's not really too much to enjoy about reading them, but I felt compelled to keep them. But the problem is, as technology has progressed, we have this overwhelming amount of personal data, and it's just, I had trouble just understanding what to do with it or how to make sense of it. So there's a few solutions. Maybe the most obvious is to talk to a therapist. This is not what I did. I decided to build a Memex. So I'm now going to talk about, I guess, my version of trying to take this historical idea and make it my own and do something useful with it. So the first part of the project was really about gathering data. So all these services that we use, all the files that I had, all the documents that I kept, I started having to write importers. So for all my reading activity and browsing activity, I have a complete record of my browser history. I use only an ebook reader, so I have good logs of what I read. I have all my digital consumption, so if I come across something on Twitter, I have a record of it. If I listen to a podcast or a song, it's in there. And these are based on APIs or services that I use. I have location history all coming from my phone. And then all my social and messaging, I have records of these from kind of high school onwards. And then finally, there's a lot of soft data, like journals or notes that I've taken or photos that I've taken, and these are all meaningful, and I've written importers for the different services and types of files that I have. So just to go over the details again, so I have stuff from almost 1995 onwards. Probably for every day since then, I have at least a couple of records. And there's about 6 million of them. These are activities, things I've done. And then 5 million entities. So these are people, places, things. And it's organized as a graph, and there's about 17 million relationships that hold everything together. So this is the live demo time. So Reg was telling us speakers, he was sharing some advice. He's a veteran of these things, and he said that at some point in every talk, at some point, everything that will fail will fail. So this might be the time that my live demo fails. Just cross your fingers, but we're going to give it a shot. Oh, sorry, I jumped ahead of myself there. Cool. OK, so this is the main interface that's showing up. Everything's oriented around doing queries on the graph that I have. So what's showing on the screen is the query builder for doing a simple search of all the things on Twitter that I've liked. So we can have a look at the results. And gets a good idea of how much is in this. I have everything I've ever liked on Twitter is available here. I can change the provider to something like this, GitHub. So now suddenly I have available all the repositories that I've starred on GitHub. It's a pretty complete record. And just to show the data structure that's underneath it, I can visualize it as a graph. And you get a sense of how everything is organized. So in the middle here is me. Everything's kind of from my perspective, of things I've done or seen or experienced. So I'm in the middle of the graph. And then you can see how they're related to, this is a particular repository that I've liked, and these are the topics or the tags that are in the repository. And you can get a sense of how this tag JavaScript has been shared by different repositories. And you can kind of explore repositories that I've liked that involve JavaScript. So to give an example of how I can use the graph structure to navigate the data, let me do a query like this. So verb listened. So this would be every song I've ever listened to, but I want to navigate the graph and do something like this. So represents this song. And I want to do where the creators are Aretha Franklin. So this is, we evaluate it from the inside out. We find Aretha Franklin nodes, then we find songs by her, and then we find the times I've listened to her. So yeah, this is every song I've listened to by Aretha Franklin. And then I can add conditions, something like this, where, so now I've added a full text search for love, so it would be every song that Aretha Franklin created that matches love, and that's the results. I could do something very general, like doing a full text search across everything. So this would be everything in my Memex that matches JavaScript. And you can see it's a mix of browser history, it's some repositories that I've liked, some emails. If we go back in time, you can see my first interactions with JavaScript in 2002, where my friend was introducing me to like what you could do with it, some horrible JavaScript, and get a sense of like the conversation. This was like the first time I had experienced JavaScript, and kind of relived the magic of pasting this into my address bar. Speaking of JavaScript, I have my full bash command line history. So this would return everything I've ever done on the terminal. But I can do something like this. And I can see the frustrating history I've had. Frustrating history I've had with JavaScript over the years. I think more usefully, I can do something like this, where I search for a particular command, and so every now and then I have to create animated GIFs, and I never remember the flags I use for the tool that I use to do it. So I have a complete record. Like this is we have our bash history file, so that's pretty normal. But what I can do is always go back and find like a particular time and explore like what I was thinking at the time, the browser history I had around the time I used the command, and a lot of the context and the thought processes come back really quickly when I have like collated data from different sources together. A big part of the Memex was about reading and documents. So I have a complete record of what I've read. Like I only read ebooks, so I have, for instance, like a log of the reading. For any one of these entries, I can look at the context of like where I was and who I was with. So with this one, I was with my partner, I was at home, and I can see the reading session was from 1:30 to 2:30, and then I can go within that and see the quotes that I saved from the book. And then a year from now, when someone's asking me about the book, I can easily kind of jump back to like my experiences of reading it, the things I liked about it, and it's pretty easy to navigate this kind of history. And then for each one of these queries, I can easily build a dashboard, and it's composed of sub-queries. So each one of these boxes is like a query, but represented in a box instead. So it's like a graph of my reading, like the last few books, the quotes I saved. So like it's a pretty flexible system that allows me to kind of like mix and match queries and use them in different ways. And again, because of the context and the different types of data I have, I can do something like occurred during. So I'm going to do a query for everything I've browsed that was on Wikipedia while reading. So sometimes you're reading and you come across something interesting and you look it up, and this becomes almost like an easy form of notes that you have, like the things you looked up while reading. So I have it available. It's pretty useful. Like sometimes I'll come across someone's name again, and I'm like, oh, I noticed that I've read their Wikipedia article. What was the context? And it's pretty easy to jump back and see the book I was reading and like other things around that time. So I mentioned that I have location history. So the verb I use is traveled. So I have like a complete record of where I've been. I can plot it on a map. And this gives a sense of like the last couple of weeks of history. But if I scroll back, I could load everything. So I can scope it down to something like this. There's a lot of clumsy words in here, like instrument, walking. But it's just I'm trying to have a general schema that works for everything. So that's the name I've used. So this again scopes it down to the times I've walked. I like taking long walks, so I can do something like this. So this is walks that are longer than 10 minutes, and I get a log of that. Sometimes I like taking long walks on the beach. So this is a log of my long walks on Bondi Beach in Australia. And it's a pretty fun way to kind of explore personal history. Sometimes this navigation data is useful for other things. Like about a year ago, I went on a road trip to Strange Loop. Has anybody been to Strange Loop? It's a great conference if you want to fly to America. It's some of the best talks, most interesting talks. So I went with my friend Max. We drove there. It was a long trip. And along the way, we listened to some podcasts. And a year later, I'm trying to remember, oh, what was that podcast I listened to while driving with Max? So I can find it pretty easily. We were in a car, and it was a long drive. And it occurred with my friend Max. So this should be a log of my long trips with Max. So it gets the route. That's pretty cool. But then what I can do is nest the query. And then I can do verb listened and represents episode. So now we're going to do everything I've listened to while on a long trip with my friend Max. And I get a log of the podcast I listened to along the way, which is pretty fun. I can also do something like this, verb photographed, pull up the photos I took along the way. And when it comes time to splitting the expenses that we incur together, I can search something like this for fuel and match the photo I took at the gas station. And what's happening here is I have OCR running on every image that comes into my Memex. So there's actually it's cropped out, but there's fuel in the image, and that lets me search for it. So I think a little bit less useful, I can do something like this. I track my eating. So this is a log of the burritos I've had. So it's all the burritos I've had in Toronto. And most of the time, this is not useful information. I don't use it, but every now and then, there's something where I was reading a book. I remember I was eating a burrito at the same time, and I liked a particular passage that I don't remember the book. I don't remember anything else about it, but I can turn on a heat map and start scrolling through my burrito history. Getting a sense of where I've been, where I've eaten burritos. Maybe it'll jog my memory about the book that I was reading. And as I'm scrolling through, eventually one of them will be the one I'm looking for, I think. Yeah, there it is. Oh, right. So I was at the bottom of the city here. I was reading a book. So let's have a look what I can find. So I can jump back to that time and find the context again. So I was at Tommy Thompson Park. I was reading a book called The Information, and I was eating a burrito, so that was great. That helped me get to it. And again, I can see all the context of other things I was doing in the park, and see the photos I've taken, see the burrito I've eaten, my friends messaging me, and then find the quote that I was looking for that I liked. So it's a bit contrived, but I think the way our brains work, we remember the smells or the places or the people around us, and this data and this form of navigating my personal history ends up being useful in all kinds of unexpected ways. Yeah, so that was the demo. Thank you. Yeah. So Reg's warning about this failing will happen at another conference, and it's not your problem, so that's good. So that's the end of the demo. I'll talk a bit about some of the details about how it's been put together and how it's been built. So first of all, let me talk about my fancy graph database that I'm using to do all this. It's called Postgres, and that's it. I was using something fancier, and Postgres is incredible. So it's basically running off one node table and one relationship table, and the types of relationships and the types of nodes are all enumerated in code, but the underlying data structure is basically two tables. And Postgres is responsible for doing all the traversals. It's responsible for the full text search, which is very good at, for the geospatial, for all the JSON stores, and it does a great job. I couldn't recommend it more. So everything's oriented around these queries. So we evaluate from the inside. We find all the nodes that match Aretha Franklin. Then we find those that are connected to songs, and then find those that are listened to. And what's actually happening with Postgres is it's just doing a bunch of inner joins with where conditions at the end. And Postgres, it sounds stupid. I didn't think it would work, but Postgres is incredibly fast at figuring out which parts of the query to do first, and it does this all with the stats engine. So this was one of the surprising things about this project. It's a pretty stupid solution, but it works really well. You could see how fast it was. So especially for a single user app, it's great. The API is also pretty simple. I'm using two endpoints. I've separated, if you've heard about CQRS, it's a separation of writing and reading. So I have a read endpoint, and this is all based around this custom query language, which is parsed and then translated into an SQL statement. And then on the other end, for all the importers and the scrapers and the other data parsers I'm using, I have another endpoint. And the importers only have write-only access, which deals with a lot of security issues. And then there's a deduping system for making sure we're not like importing nodes into the, overwriting each other and having duplicates. So the rough architecture is I have a desktop app. Inside it runs the front-end app, which you saw. And then there's another separate set of scripts that are doing all the importing in the background. And these talk to an API through the read and write interface. And the API talks to Postgres. So it's pretty simple, Postgres, as I mentioned. For the API, I'm using Rails. And I just want to say, like, the more JavaScript I do, the more I love Rails, and the more I miss it. Because it's so straightforward, and it works, and it's battle-tested. And as you can see with my RM, RF node modules, JavaScript is a lot more frustrating. But that's the way the world is, I guess. For the importers, it's a large collection of node scripts. Like, there's a wide range. Like, I'm doing some scraping. I'm doing some API integration. So it's a bunch of different scripts that are all kind of doing their own thing. For the interface, I'm using Ember.js. And then for the desktop app, I'm using Electron just to hold everything together. Some of you are wondering, oh, Ember, it was cool a couple years ago. I don't hear too much from it anymore. I just want to say, like, for a side project or like for a personal project, I don't want to spend my time upgrading libraries all the time or dealing with like a new router that came out a couple months ago that everybody says I have to use and then rewrite my app. Ember provides a lot of stability. It has a regular release schedule. It's very easy for me to just work on it and know that nothing is going to break completely. So it's like a personal reason I love it. The community is great, and the community likes to kind of like come together on a solution to a problem and agree that's how it is. It's not for everybody, but I like that because it lets me focus on application development and not like rewriting a router every couple months. So that's what I want to say about Ember. I love it, and if you haven't seen it in a while, have a look. Electron is used, as I said, to hold everything together. It has a bit of a tab system. I didn't show in the demo, but I have different tabs, so it's acting kind of like a good desktop app. I also used Electron to have an installer. So if you want to run the API in Docker, the Electron app will actually spin up the Docker instance and set up the databases. So I have the interface for that. You can kind of get a sense of how it would work. And then it controls the import schedules and how things are running that way. So you might have seen this. You're wondering, where's this project going? That's a good question. I don't really know the answer. There's a version of this that's all about quantified self. Is anybody into the quantified self movement? Not too many hands. That's OK. So I think originally, like, a big part of the draw for me was the quantified self and having numbers about my life and being able to chart everything. So this, like, the project started in this way. This is a graph of like my different types of drinks I've had over different hours of the day. So you can see in the purple where my beer consumption goes up, for instance. So it's kind of fun data that I have a lot of. This is a map of where my heart rate has been very high, and you can see where I play basketball every week. Or you can see a graph I made of the left axis is minutes on my bicycle, and the bottom axis is the perceived temperature outside. So as it gets colder, I ride my bike less. But I think this example shows kind of like the weakness of the quantified self movement is that you collect all this data, you put a lot of work into it, and it tells you that when it's cold, you don't ride your bike. And you don't really need a graph or an API to tell you this. You kind of know a lot about yourself, and you don't need quantified self movement to tell you that. So I've kind of been a bit dissatisfied by the quantified self movement. I'm less interested in it. I'm more interested in like the qualitative stuff, like my thoughts, my history, what I was reading, what my conversations were, and I think that communicates a lot more about things I'm trying to understand. And in some ways, I'm thinking of this as a weird art project. It's like, how far can I get with like putting all my personal history into one place? Like, what can I do with it? And I can do some art with it. Like I whipped this up a couple weeks ago, where I just take something out of context of things I've said, put it in the same screen, and it doesn't really mean anything individually, but maybe as I see it collectively, a feeling comes back, or a piece of history comes back, or a new idea comes out of it. And this is all just like kind of decontextualizing my own thoughts or history. Earlier, I showed my MSN chat history from high school. Most of you are wondering, why the hell would I keep that? It's pretty useless. I agree, but recently I I built a chatbot that was trained only on my high school chat logs, and it was as horrific as you might imagine. And then I trained it on another chatbot that was only trained on more recent conversations, and I got them to talk to each other, and they had a conversation. The level of discourse wasn't very great. The machine learning is very good at image classification, but maybe not as good as generating text. But it was a fun project. There's a video on the Bang Bang Con YouTube page where you can find it if you're interested. So that's the art stuff. But I think in general, this whole project is just a long-running personal experiment. I don't know where it's going. I don't know what the goal is. I just want to see what happens when so much of my life is available for introspection, for querying, for understanding. One of my heroes, actually, Reg mentioned him in the intro, was Doug Engelbart. And one of the things he used to do in his lab was tie a brick to a pencil and then get people to just write their thoughts and fill in. And as you can guess, people don't write very well. But the more interesting thing about this is that actually, because of the lag in the tool, people don't think as fast, and kind of the expression that you have when you're writing is actually restricted by the big brick on your pencil. And I like that analogy a lot. Like, I feel that if I have this tool for easily accessing my history, a whole bunch of behavior will emerge that wasn't possible without having this tool. So perhaps in 2028, you can return to full stack, and you can see where this experiment has gone. You can read about the augmented reality version where I see the history in my screen. I don't know, but I will continue to work on this for as long as I can. And yeah, I'm planning to open source most of it. So if you are interested, I do have a newsletter and a URL that you can sign up for. It will be available as an open source project. So to conclude, I'm going to talk about back to the original Memex, the version from 1945. Because, show of hands, who heard about the Memex before this talk? Has anybody heard it? So Reg has, a few other people. It's talked about a lot in kind of a history of technology, especially because it led to the internet, and it was a big idea. And I think if you just hear the Memex story in isolation, you think of it as being this big event that everybody saw and interacted with, and it was kind of inevitable that it would lead to the web. But here's the thing about the Memex, as I've been reading about it and researching the history. It was weird. Everything about it was weird. It was just a weird project. Some of you might have concluded this when you saw this camera. It's a weird project. But there were a lot of other things that were weird about it. So first of all, the form factor was very weird. So back in the 1930s and 40s when this came out, this was what a computer looked like. It was literally a room of people doing calculations at a station. This was the computer. If you don't believe me, this is the label here, the computing division. So this is, when you say computer, this is what people think about. And then a bit later, this is a hard drive in the 1950s, and computers were big. Computers were, not a form factor of a person at a desk using it. And just to give a better idea, someone actually tried to recreate what a Memex would have looked like. So you can just get a better idea, like a desk-sized device where you'd sit at and use it. So this was pretty new and really wasn't shown. It didn't emerge until much later. So at the time, it was just weird. This was something weird about it. Another thing about the Memex that was weird was the problem it solved. So computers were typically used for big, important problems, like cracking Nazi codes in the World War II. This was for doing calculus and integrals. This was a computer being used for the census. So computers were used for these very difficult, hard problems that were, important. The Memex was weird because it solved a problem for individuals, and it wasn't a problem that you could put a bounding box around. It was not a problem that people would say they have, but the Memex attempted to solve a very personal problem for people. Another reason the Memex was weird was for the technologies it used. So even for its time, the Memex was using very old technologies. It was using microfilm, which was already kind of not the cool thing anymore. What was emerging in the 1940s were the vacuum tubes. And they were in the new computers. This was the first digital computer being programmed, and it was all vacuum tube based. But Vannevar Bush understood analog computers, he understood microfilm, and he kind of stuck with the tools that he understood to make it work. And it was sort of weird in that it was a device that came out, it was very futuristic in some ways, but it was also very backwards looking in other ways. And then, as the Memex essay came out, the creator of Vannevar Bush kept on working in it, and over the years he published new versions of it. And everything about the choices that he talked about and the technologies that he wanted to incorporate were weird. So he talked about using crystals as a persistence layer. He talked about using mind control to maybe control the Memex. And like none of this was like really grounded in actual technology. It was speculative. But it was, for the creator, it was more about the conceptual idea of the Memex rather than the specific technologies. But I think the weirdest thing about, another weird thing about the Memex was how it was published. So you'd think that such an important piece of history would be published in a journal or something like that. It was actually published in the Atlantic magazine, which is a general audience magazine. And you can see it in the table of contents here. It's surrounded by a poem, an article about ships and subsidies, and my favorite, The Egg and I don't know what it is, but it sounds pretty good. So this was kind of an unusual place to have computer history. The next version of it was published in Life magazine, which is even more general. And here it is in the table of contents, the essay from where I got the picture from. It's surrounded by advertisements for deodorant, and if you look carefully, an advertisement for laxatives. So one of the most important computer science history ideas was, this is like how it was introduced to the world. So it was unusual in that sense. But I think the biggest thing to me that was weird about it was, I said these things, but the biggest thing that was weird about it was, for the creator of Vannevar Bush, it was just one of many side projects that he had. He was a busy guy. He actually, he was the leader of what became the National Science Foundation. He was actually secretly the civilian oversight of the Manhattan Project in the 1940s. And then he was a co-founder of Raytheon, which is one of the biggest arms manufacturers. So he was a busy guy. He had a lot of roles. He had a lot of things that he was involved with. But the Memex was this side project that he kept on working on from his early career until the day he retired. Here he's in his shack, in the backyard shack, just tinkering away. And he kept on working on this, but many other things. And I think that's the most interesting thing about the Memex. It was a side project that was released as a side project in the form of an essay, and it had this incredible impact on the world. So a researcher named Linda Smith in 1981 looked at all the citations of the Memex over the years, and she kind of classified, like some people glommed onto the technology, some people liked the associative data structures, some people liked other aspects of it. Everybody kind of took something interesting about the Memex and did their work based on it, and it was very inspirational in that sense. Some people kind of play around with the idea of like how many things the Memex led to. Like this is a family tree where like literally every piece of software traces its origins to the Memex. So you can kind of like have fun with this idea, but there's no doubt it was really, really important. And I'll tell one story in particular. So this is Doug Engelbart. He was the creator of the mouse, but I think that short sells the story very much. He created almost like the way modern computing works. And he read the essay, he was bored, he read it, he came across it, and he was like, I'm going to devote my life to making this a reality. And it took almost 20 years for him to get the funding and the tools to build it. But this is his notes of the Memex essay, and you can see how inspired he was. And the mother of all demos, which Reg mentioned really in passing, it happened in 1968. It was a demo on stage in front of a bunch of computer science professionals. And it showed interactive computing for the first time. It showed video conferencing for the first time. It showed hyperlinks for the first time. There were a bunch of firsts that people had never seen on screen before. And this was really the start of interactive computing. And even like the form factor that came out of this demo was very modern, like the keyboard, the interactive screen, and a mouse. This was an early version. This is a couple of years later, but you can kind of, this was in the mid 60s, right? And you can see like how this was the first time people used a computer like this, and the form factor has kind of like remained with us since then. And this was a direct descendant of the Memex. And I think more recently, Tim Berners-Lee, when he was creating the internet, was very inspired by the Memex and the idea of like navigating through a graph structure and hyperlinks. And he will admit that like so many of the ideas came from this Memex essay. So the simple side project that Vannevar Bush had ended up changing the world in incredible ways. So side projects, we hear about them a lot in technology. We're all busy people. We all have responsibilities that get in the way of us having the luxury of time to work on a side project, and they're not for everybody. But I just want to put it out there that a simple side project, if you have the time for it and you can manage to do it, can change the world. And I think especially the weird ones and the experimental ones. And I think this is exactly when you should use your skills as technologists to just really explore what you can do with it. We have a lot of power as software developers, and sometimes the power that we have can be used to translate into these incredible devices that change the world. So just to go back to my version of it for a brief second, a lot of it is not too useful, a lot of it is experimental, but like a lot of it is pretty useful. So coming to this trip, I know I'm going to see Reg. We're friends from Toronto. I can explore all the things that we've talked about over the years and remind myself of all the funny tweets he's had. And then when we have a conversation, I can reference those things, and it's a lot of context that I can bring back. So after Barcelona, I'm going to be going to Berlin, and I can remind myself of friends who've been there and what they've seen, and remind myself of like, what places to go visit and see. This is the last time I was there. This is a heat map of like the places I've been, and it might jog my memory to maybe go to a different neighborhood that I haven't seen before. In Berlin, I'm going to go to my favorite electronic music artist, Robert Henke. He has a show on next Thursday. And I can see my history of interacting with him and learning about his music. You can see the time I put it on my concert bucket list. So it's kind of cool context that I can bring back and use on a day-to-day basis. And in fact, I use this all the time. Almost every time I come across a name or a search term, I'll just run it into my Memex and see what comes up. And usually there's something there that I can bring back context from. So it's turning out to be pretty useful. That's the end of my presentation. I'd love to hear questions if you have any. Yeah.